Well, hello everybody and welcome to Unit 1 of the latest Lunch and Learn program or series. I'm sure you're going to enjoy the 6 sessions that we have together. I just want to check and also give people a chance to familiarise yourself with the system. If you look over on the right hand side, if you're not used to this sort of technology, you'll notice there's a little box that says questions. I'm just keen to hear whether or not my sound's coming across well, because the last thing I want to do is to be talking to myself. So could you just type in there clear, all clear, or something along those lines? I just need to know I'm not talking to myself. Thank you. Great. Thanks, Christy. Thanks, John. Thanks, William. Thanks, Sarah. Okay. I think I must be coming across loud and clear. So welcome to you all. We've got people from all over Australia in this presentation. We've got people internationally as well, and I realise, of course, internationally it's not lunchtime. So a warm welcome to you, whether it's evening or morning. So welcome to everyone. So I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping to start with and just explain how the process works and give you a chance to familiarise yourself with the series. So I just want to let people know that I encourage you to ask questions, make comments, share personal experiences, whatever, at any stage during the broadcast. So if there's something that you'd like to ask or something you'd like to say, you just simply go over to the question box and type in that, and I'll keep an eye on that, and that way it'll give me an opportunity to stop at certain stages and respond in time to your comment or question. And that way we keep it as interactive as possible. You can probably understand with so many people online, it's not possible just to unmute everybody, because it just could be absolute chaos in that case. So we'll get you to type in your statement, comment, question, whatever, and that way we can keep things moving at a nice rate. Okay, so let's get underway. If I can just show you the program in its entirety, that would be the first thing that I'd like to do. And just to explain to you why we've got these particular units in place, and just a little bit about each one so I can preview it. Now, what will happen at the end of each of these sessions is that you'll receive an email from me, in fact fairly quickly this afternoon, and in that email you'll have a copy of the slides, and you'll also have a copy of the recording so that you can review the material at any particular times. And of course the third thing you'll get is a link to register for the next unit. So just bear in mind you have to register for each unit, and of course that's not onerous. You just put your name and your email address in, and that creates a registration for each unit. So if you do that this afternoon, you'll be all ready to go for Unit 2, which will basically mean you'll get emails and reminders. And my strong suggestion is, and you've got the dates there on your screen, my strong suggestion is that you actually put those dates into your diary and make that a priority. Otherwise what happens is that you forget why you're doing this and so forth, and of course that's not a good way to start. So let me go through. We're going to talk about feedback to start with, and obviously feedback is critically important to all of us. We all need feedback. So we're going to talk about a few issues there around how you might give better feedback. And feedback, of course, doesn't have to be negative. It can be positive. Any sort of feedback is good feedback in the sense that people require it. So at the end of each unit, and you can notice there's about 2 weeks between each, at the end of each you're required to do some homework, which really is very practical. It requires you to try some new things in the workplace, and the good news about the Lunch and Learn series is that you can actually apply these immediately. So you can come straight out of this and go straight in and apply what you've learnt, and a lot of it is very practical. In Unit 2, you'll notice we're talking about influencing skills, and influencing skills are really important because all of us, including myself, are involved in the process of influencing. So in order to set us up for Unit 2, I'm going to send you a diagnostic to do, and what that diagnostic will do is give you the opportunity to create a 14-page report on your influencing approach and style, so that when we come back for Unit 2 on the 28th of July, it'll be very much a debrief around your report, and I'm sure you'll find that very interesting. In terms of Unit 3, we're looking at optimizing team performance, and essentially what I'm going to be talking about there is very much around the conversation. That is the organisational conversation, not the personal conversation, and how best to get your team to optimal performance. And most of you, of course, will be team leaders, whether you're in a senior role or not, and getting the team to be working together is always a perennial challenge. So I'm going to give you some tips and hints on how to do that. In Module 4, you'll notice it's really around getting the best out of other people. And I suppose one of the ways you can conceptualize this job, the job that you have, that is the job of leadership, is to attempt to get, your job is actually to get the very best from the people that you lead. So if people are operating at 60%, it's really about getting them to 70%. Or if people are operating at 80%, it's about getting them to 90%. So we'll talk about some tried and true ways of doing that. In Module 5, we'll talk about understanding people and their personalities, and we've all, of course, had a personality clash in our life, and often the result of that is, or the symptom of that is, because we don't see things the same way as the other person. So it's not so much the golden rule about treating people how you want to be treated, it's really the platinum rule about treating people how they want to be treated. So we'll actually look at that in Module 5. And in Module 6, our whole life is a meeting, and you could argue that this is a meeting and we finish here and you'll be into another meeting and another meeting and another meeting, and it never ends. So, and of course a lot of those meetings you're required to run. So let's talk about how we run more effective meetings. I'd argue that that's an extremely important skill, and one that if you become good at it can make a huge difference in terms of your leverage as a leader. So essentially there are 5 modules, each will go for an hour. As I said before, I think it's very important for you to diarise those times and dates so that you make this a priority, because otherwise what happens is that busyness gets in the way and you forget that you've enrolled in a very important part of your own development, which of course is leadership development. Okay, so moving on. I'm going to turn off the video primarily so I can see the screen, and I'll probably bring it back a little bit later. So I'll just get rid of that. And so what you're actually seeing here is some research which is very interesting around feedback. And you'll notice that the blue line is really around levels of engagement, and the red line is very much around levels of disengagement. So if you look up the top, you'll notice that if you give people strength-based feedback, in other words, positive feedback, things that they're doing right, you'll have a high possibility of engaging people. So if you walk out of here and you set a goal to give three bits of feedback a day, which is positive, you'll find that it'll make a huge difference. It's easier said than done. Most things are. Now, what's interesting about all this is not so much that, but the fact that the second line, excuse me, the second line shows receiving critical feedback. So you can see there's still a high level of engagement. So if you only give people negative feedback, then you will still engage people, albeit in a disgruntled sort of way. They'll still be engaged. But what's really interesting about this research is the bottom line. The bottom line shows that people who don't give any feedback at all, whether it be positive or negative, will actually disengage employees. So you can see that it's really important to give any feedback, whether it's positive or negative. So no feedback spells disengagement. So it's important to recognise that, because a lot of people feel uncomfortable about giving negative feedback in the sense that they feel it'll disengage employees. So what they do is they give no feedback, but in actual fact what that does is disengage people. So just an important starting point to say that we should be trying to engage people by giving any sort of feedback, both positive and negative. And that, of course, is going to be part of your homework today. All right, so a couple of key points about feedback that's important. Roughly by a margin of 3-to-1, team members believe that constructive feedback does more to improve their performance than positive feedback. So people want to know basically where the line in the sand is, and that's important. So they often won't necessarily like where the line in the sand is, but they need to know, and this is important. So I should be able to walk up to anyone that you lead and ask them specifically what your expectations of them are, and they should be able to rattle off very quickly what they are. If they're umming and ahhing about it, that would suggest that you're not giving them enough feedback. So that's the first key point. The secret of having employees listen to your feedback is whether they respect you. So it's one thing giving feedback, but it's another thing being in the business of being respected. Now, if you're not respected, then the feedback, of course, will fall on deaf ears, because they'll be just focused on the person giving the feedback rather than the feedback itself. So it's really important that you're in the business of being respected, not liked. And often people in your role, in any sort of leadership role, will often forget that you're actually in the business of being respected, not necessarily liked. Now, obviously, if you're giving feedback on a regular basis and it's fair and it's reasonable and it's objective and so forth, then that in itself will lead to respect, and vice versa. If you don't do that, it's likely to lead to disrespect. But nevertheless, respect is earned, and it's incredibly hard to get, and it requires what I call authenticity. So it means being very authentic with people. And in other words, I simply mean being yourself, not being something that you're not, because people sense that straight away. So I'm hoping through this program that you learn to be more of who you are rather than trying to be somebody that you're not, and that's critically important. Another key point here is that you should have the exact same thing said. If you say the exact same thing to two people, it can have two different impacts. So you can be very consistent, you can be very objective, you can be very measured, you can be very diplomatic, and you can say exactly the same thing to two people and get completely different effects. So what does that mean? Well, there's a responsibility on behalf of the person receiving the feedback to receive it in the right way. But that's their responsibility, not yours. And one of the best ways of helping people to gain that responsibility is to give feedback. All right, so it's not a dog chasing its own tail in the sense that leaders wait and hope that people will be mature enough to receive the feedback, and when they are, I'll start giving feedback. And of course the team member is saying, well, I don't receive enough feedback, so I haven't had much practice at receiving feedback. So the message out of all that is give feedback, and give it regularly, and give it consistently, Give it both positively and negatively. So here's some important statistics that I want you to have a look at. There's a lot of material on this slide, but have a think about some of these things here. That 30% of performance reviews actually end up in decreasing employee performance. You can probably work out, if you know anything about my work, that I'm very anti-performance reviews, which incidentally doesn't mean that I'm anti-feedback. It's a difference. So performance reviews are not the place to save up all your feedback and hit people right between the eyes. It's not the place to do that. Feedback should be every day, moment by moment, situation by situation, project by project, incident by incident, every day, in every way, giving feedback. 58% of executives believe their current program doesn't result in performance or engagement. So a significant number of people, and this information is global, a lot of people across a lot of countries, across many, many industries, would argue that their situation or their platform is not giving them the opportunity to engage people. 70% of companies are now reconsidering their performance strategy, and you've probably seen a lot of this in the news, in the media, how companies like Google and General Electric and so forth are now moving away from performance reviews and moving towards a more casual conversation model of feedback. 2 out of 3 employees with highest performance scores aren't actually the highest performers. In other words, their whole rating system is fraught with subjectivity. So people give people ratings, and often what they do is they either rate them too high, or what they do is they rate them in the middle to be safe. But often those things are not accurate. And we'll talk more about that as we go through the series. 6% of companies surveyed think performance reviews are not worth the time. So that's worth the time. Sorry about that. So that means 94% think they're a waste of time. 2% of executives say that the annual evaluations are useful. Only 2%. 80% of workers are dissatisfied with the performance review. 3%, 3 to 5% improvement in performance, all managers believe can be generated in the process. Look, there's some serious issues there which all point to one key message for you and me, and that is this. We need to be giving people regular, ongoing, systematic, authentic feedback. And if we do that on a regular basis, what you'll find is that you'll engage people in a lot better way. So guys, I'm just going to give you a chance now to pause, and you might want to type any questions or comments or observations. Please go ahead and do that, and we'll get used to this. And I guess as the whole series warms up, people tend to become more and more animated, if you like, in terms of adding statements and questions. So please go ahead and do that. I'm more than happy to receive those and keep this as interactive as we can. So while you're doing that, let's move on. So let me talk about expectations for a moment. It's really important for you as the leader to manage the expectations that you have of the people you lead. And there's a lot of ways of doing that, and I want to run through some key questions. And while I'm going through these questions, I want you to have a think for yourself about how well I do these things, because this is the source of getting it right. This is the line in the sand that I was talking about earlier. So, do you know what your expectations are as a leader? Are you absolutely crystal clear in your mind what you expect of the people that work for you? That's the very first point. Once you've worked that out, there's another question is, have you actually communicated those expectations to the people that you lead? So it's one thing having it in your head, it's another thing to have communicated it with the people that work with you. Now, I suspect that you'll probably got a higher rating on that than perhaps the people that you lead. In other words, this is something that must be done with persistence and consistency. You need to communicate your expectations around projects, around incidents, around situations, around all sorts of scenarios in the workplace. The most effective time to communicate your expectations are in the moment when something has occurred. So in other words, if somebody's actually exceeded your expectations, you should tell them that. If somebody has not achieved the expectations that you have of them, you should tell them that. So communicating expectations is not done via email. It shouldn't be done in a team meeting. It should be done on the run, moment by moment, incident by incident. The third key element of expectations is it's one thing to know what your expectations are. It's another thing to have communicated them. But yet still, there's another thing is, do your team members actually understand what those expectations are? Just because you've communicated it to someone doesn't mean they understand it. So it's important that you make sure that they understand not only what the expectation is, but why the expectation is what it is. Because clearly if they don't understand it, then they're not going to meet it. The fourth question you've got to ask yourself is, do they accept the standards? So it's one thing having the standards, it's another thing communicating the standards, it's another thing understanding the standards, and yet another thing about, do they actually accept the standards? Right? So if they disagree with where you put the crossbar, if I can use that metaphor, if they disagree with that, then it's likely that they won't respect it, and it's likely that they won't meet it. So you need to get people to not only understand but also accept that that's a reasonable expectation for them. Then there's another question about, are your team members omitted to meeting those expectations? So, sorry, that should be permitted. Are my team members permitted? Are they given the tools, the information and the resources to meet those expectations? For example, it's no good giving somebody an unrealistic deadline to meet when they've got several priorities that they've got to achieve, and that all those priorities are considered to be important. So if we give people an unrealistic timeline to meet expectations, we can't really expect that they're going to meet those expectations. So we need to be clear about whether or not we're supporting them to meet those expectations. Now, I don't mean being lenient either. I just mean being realistic about what you're asking people to do. Then there's another question around, do my team members know how they're performing against those expectations? All right, so having an expectation in your mind, communicating it, letting them know, making sure they understand it. Do they accept it? Have they got the capacity to meet it? And then the question becomes, are they meeting it? And am I giving expectations around how they meet those expectations? This is about feedback, naturally. Am I supporting my team members to achieve those expectations? So am I coaching people? Am I explaining to people what's expected? Am I encouraging people to do what I want them to do? Am I doing those things? And if I'm doing those things, then there's a better chance that they'll meet that metaphorical crossbar I talked about earlier. And if I just go back before I move on. So you can see, folks, that managing expectations is quite a complex requirement. And I just really am giving you the opportunity to think for yourself for a moment, which of those am I not doing as effectively as I could be? Which of those am I doing very, very well? And which of those could I perhaps be improving upon? Because if any of those questions aren't answered, then it's likely that people will not meet your expectations. And it could be for a whole host of those reasons that I've mentioned. Okay, so what are some of the ingredients about giving people feedback, and what are the importance elements of this? One of the key things I think in giving people feedback is timing. Timing is everything. What I mean by that is that the best time to give people feedback is the moment after an incident has occurred, right? Not 1 hour after, not 2 days after, not 3 weeks after, not 6 months after, but immediately after the event. So for example, if somebody has exceeded your expectations, the time to have the greatest impact in terms of your feedback is the moment after the event. So for example, if someone has dealt really effectively with an extremely difficult customer, and they've done it and they've kept their cool and they've done it with great professionalism, the time to talk to them about that is immediately once they get off the phone or once they're out of earshot of the customer. That's the time to do it, and that's where it'll have the greatest impact. Or if somebody, for example, is negative, excessively negative in a team meeting, the time to talk to them about that negativity is immediately at the conclusion of the meeting before you move on to do something else. And that has a huge potential impact because it sends a message to the person receiving the feedback that this is so important, it is the high priority. How do I know? Because I'm giving you this feedback immediately after the event. Now I know it's not always practical to do that, and sometimes you have to wait a day, a week, or maybe even a month to actually give them that feedback. But just understand this, that the longer you leave the feedback, the less impact it will have. And what I find is that there are a lot of leaders who will often give people feedback during the performance review process. So what they do is they store it all up and they wait until the performance feedback and then performance review, and then they give them this feedback. It's not going to be very effective, because if you said to somebody, look, I forgot, you say to somebody in the performance review, I didn't get a chance to talk to you about this 6 months ago, but I just want to let you know that I was really happy with the way you presented that report at the management meeting. Now, what the other person's thinking in their head is, if you really thought that that report was exceptional, you would have given me that feedback at the time. And it works the other way too when you're giving negative feedback. So timing is critically important. Another key element of feedback is being very specific. All right, so generalized feedback does not work. So for example, if you said to somebody, you've really got to improve your attitude, you will find that that will actually just make things worse, notwithstanding the fact that you have a real issue with their attitude. Far better to say to somebody, we have had 3 meetings in 3 weeks, and each time somebody's come up with a recommendation or a suggestion when I've asked for it, you've knocked it on the head and been negative. Isn't that a far better way of giving the feedback? Because it's specific to 3 incidents that can be recalled by the person. Now they might argue that I was just trying to be constructive, but the fact of the matter is you're focusing in on specific incidents, and that becomes critically important. So you should always base your feedback on critical scenarios, critical incidents. So you're looking and observing examples of where you can give specific feedback, and that way what happens is it becomes contextualized. It becomes relevant to the work that people are doing. So it's really important to think carefully about a situation or an example or an incident that you can use to broach a particular piece of feedback. And I'm talking both positive and negative. It's no good saying to someone, you always present well. Okay, that's quite a nice thing to say, but it's far better to say to somebody, the last two presentations that I sat in on, I thought you did an exceptional job at presenting. You see, it's far more effective. So keep the comments and questions coming through, folks, because I'm more than happy to accept questions and comments as we go through this presentation. Moving right along, here's a couple of issues that I'd like to talk about with being specific, because we're just on the topic about being specific. Let's talk about it for a moment. So I gave you a couple of examples before. Here's another one. If you said to someone, overall, good job on the presentation at this morning's meeting, but it could have been better. Right, now you've said that, but the trouble with that feedback is that it's too vague. So the question is, what was wrong with it? Plus, just because you didn't like it doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad. How could it have been better? These are the questions lingering in the mind of the person that you've just given the feedback to. So it's much better to say something like this, coming up on your screen now. There it is. So what about if you said this? What about if you said, great job on the presentation. I really liked how you used statistics to back up your key points. One small comment though, maybe for next time it would be a good idea to invite more comments from the group to get them more engaged or involved. You see how effective that will be. Now, the other person may not necessarily agree with that, but you can see they know what you're talking about, and they're far more enlightened about what the feedback is that you're giving people in the based on that presentation. So you can see how that actually works. Now, I have spoken a little bit about this topic already today, but let me also reinforce it. Feedback is never-ending. It should be daily, weekly, monthly, annually. So it never ends. And the homework that I'm going to give you is not onerous, but it may be challenging for you in the sense that you may not have been doing this as much as you should. But I'm going to ask you to give 3 bits of feedback every single day. So whether it's a shift or whether it's a work day, every single day, 3 bits of feedback. Now, that 3 bits of feedback can be given to the one person. Those 3 bits of feedback can be given to 3 different people. Those 3 different bits of feedback can be given for different circumstances. Those 3 bits of feedback can be given for positive contributions. Those 3 bits of feedback can be given for negative feedback. But I want you to get into the habit of giving 3 bits of feedback every single day. Now, after a while, of course, it'll become habitual, And once it becomes habitual, it'll be a bit hard to break the habit. You'll find some amazing results if you do this. You'll get some funny looks to start with because they're not used to you doing this, perhaps. But don't worry, it's only because it's an unusual thing. But after a while, they'll get used to it, and so will you, and that's the critically important thing. So every single day. Now, another important point about feedback that I don't think we address enough is that feedback is not you just giving somebody a lecture about something that they could have done better, faster, easier. How about you ask people for their feedback first? So you say to people, before I talk to you about that report that you put together for me, I'm just keen to know, what do you think about the report that you gave? And then bite your tongue until it bleeds and listen to what they have to say about their own feedback. You can still disagree with it, or you can agree with it. But the important thing is to try to engage the other person in the feedback. And that requires you asking open-ended questions. Why, what, where, who, how, and which. All of those words will precipitate more than a one-word answer. In other words, a yes or no. So I'm interested. Why did you say that? What did you mean? Who did you speak to? When did it take place? And what you're doing is you're engaging the other person in a dialogue so that it doesn't just become a monologue where you're just giving people a kind of a diatribe about what they could be doing better or what you think they did well. And unfortunately, all of us that are in this broadcast have been trained to learn to answer questions. So whether you have a trade or whether you have a degree, whatever training you've done, you have been required to answer questions. That's the whole basis of an education, to give you an opportunity to be able to answer difficult questions or challenging questions. And now here am I suggesting to you that now you're in the business of asking questions. But at the end of the day, that's your job, to be asking questions. And you'll find that that's a big theme throughout this series, that I'm wanting you to ask lots and lots and lots of questions because it engages people. Now, privacy. Let me talk a little bit about privacy. There is a saying that goes around that we should praise people in public and criticize people in private. I'm not convinced about that. There are some very shy, introverted people who really don't want attention drawn to them by being singled out at a morning tea or in a team meeting. So just be careful with that. People can often get quite embarrassed and don't feel comfortable about it. So my strong suggestion, and I think it's a safe thing to do, is give both positive and negative feedback in private. All right, now I know for some of you that's going to be difficult because you work in open office environments, or you might be working outdoors in a construction scenario, or it's not that easy to get people away privately. So think carefully and perhaps even creatively about how you can pull people aside to give them the feedback that you need to give them. So I just think it's a better way to go. I think it also shows a lot of respect for the other person, for the fact that you're doing that in a one-on-one situation. Because it is true, people sometimes feel embarrassed when you single them out amongst a bunch of other people. So just do it in private. It will have no less effect, and in some cases it can actually have a better effect. Besides, if it's negative feedback and it goes off the rails, at least no one else is around and you save a bit of face. So That's the worst case scenario, but yep, I believe feedback should be done in private. So think about how you do that, and I know it's challenging. So we just got a question here asking about open office and how can we find the time and the space to give feedback. Yeah, look, I realise open office becomes very difficult. So, and sometimes booking a room to give a 2-minute piece of feedback is not easy. Look, I think whatever you have to do, if you could say to someone, look, can I have a word with you? I just want to do this in private. So you actually say that. Let's move outside. And then you go outside or find some place in the building where you're not going to be disturbed or people aren't listening in. And of course, if you've got the luxury of an office, you can always invite people into the office, close the door and give the feedback, both positive and negative. So thanks for the question. Really appreciate that. It's just finding time and space to be able to do that. I mentioned this before and I still think, I'd like to reinforce that please use critical incidents to give feedback. So look at real life scenarios that have occurred in the workplace, projects that people have completed, or incidents they've been involved in as the basis for giving feedback. Which basically means this: you can't really plan for when you're giving feedback because it's one of those things that have to be done in the moment. So you just got to keep your eyes and ears open and look for opportunities, and once a critical incident has occurred and you think it's a wonderful opportunity to give positive or negative feedback, then you need to strike. You need to pull the person aside and let them know what you liked or perhaps what you didn't like. But before you do that, ask them how they thought they handled the situation. Throw a question in there first. Now, I think it's very important to understand what is the reason that we give feedback. Why do we even bother to do it? What's the point of putting ourselves on the line? Well, the reason that we give people feedback is we're trying to get people to either continue to do what they're doing well for the future or to stop doing what they're not doing for the future. In other words, we're trying to create a better future. At the end of the day, feedback is about creating a better future. So there's no point in talking to people about what they should have or shouldn't have done in the incident, because that's ancient history. But really the focus is on how we might do things differently in the future, or how might they continue to do what they did in a very positive way in the future. So if somebody that you're giving feedback to, and normally it would be in a negative feedback situation, if they want to sort of wallow around in excuses about why this didn't happen and they didn't receive this information and they weren't informed and nobody told them and so rah, 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 I think what you need to say is, look, just stop for a moment. I'm really more interested in the future and I really want to talk about how we might prevent this from happening again. Then you might talk about those things from the point of view of prevention for the future. But don't wallow around talking about excuses or pointing the finger of blame or anything else, because quite frankly that's counterproductive. It doesn't work. It's not effective, because the feedback is really there to help somebody to shape their future in a way that's very positive for them. So just keep that in mind, that it's all about the future. Now, folks, what I want to focus on now, and most people will find that this is the most difficult bit of feedback of all, so I thought we'd spend a bit of time on it. How about we look at some guidelines for conversations on poor performance, because all of us know that that's probably one of the most difficult conversations we have to have. Sometimes it can go off the rails, and what happens, of course, is that we avoid them because we don't want them to go off the rails. So here's a few things to keep in mind. If you have to pull someone up about poor performance, the very first thing that I suggest you do, and remember, do this in private, is get straight to the point. This is not about idle chit-chat and putting people at ease, because quite frankly, if you're pulling persons aside about poor performance and you haven't got to the point, the person's anxiety level is actually going up because they know it must be serious because you pulled them aside. But if you're talking about, how their day's gone and all the rest of it before you get to the point, then you're only actually making it worse. Just get straight to the point. Now, when I say getting straight to the point, I'm not saying hit them right between the eyes. I simply mean think carefully about the words that you are going to use to broach the poor performance. Think carefully about it, using some of the guidelines that I've gone through previously. And if you can't articulate to yourself what way you might express this, then think before you speak, because the first words to come out of your mouth are critically important to how well the conversation goes. It's very important, of course, to explain the purpose of the meeting, and it is a meeting, albeit one-on-one. Explain to them that the reason I wanted to talk to you was about the incident that just occurred, and in particular I want to talk about, and then let them know what it is. All right? So in other words, that's the best way to put the person at ease, is getting straight to the point and explaining the purpose of this particular conversation. Because frankly, some people will not know what it is that you want to talk to them about. They're not mind readers, and they might not even know that the performance that you want to talk to them about is substandard, which is, of course, a bit of a reflection on yourself, because perhaps you haven't articulated what it is that you expect of other people. Thirdly, it's very important to shut up and let the other person speak. This is not about you giving them a lecture. So you explain why you want to meet with them, you do it in private, you do it with a degree of specificity, and you do it the right way, and then you keep quiet and you ask them what they thought. So what do you think about the point I just made? Or how do you think the incident went? Or what was your first reaction about the way you dealt with that customer? Right? I want them engaged in this conversation. I don't want them to be disengaged. And the best way to engage someone and to take the pressure off you is to get them to speak. Okay? Once you've got them speaking, you can start collecting your thoughts. And of course, if they don't have any comment to make, then just ask them, so I'm interested to know, why don't you have a comment to make? Don't let them off the hook. Okay, moving on. Number 4. When they're actually talking to you about the question that you've asked about their feedback, please don't interrupt them. It's so easy to do, but if you interrupt the person while they're speaking, then what's going to happen, apart from being disrespectful, is that they have a license to interrupt you, and that's not really a good thing. So even if they say something stupid, they say something provocative, they press your buttons, I don't care what it is, you must maintain self-control and hear them out, and at the end, once they've drawn breath, you can then say, there's a couple of things you said there I'd like to respond to. Or there was one thing there that you said that I don't believe is correct. Okay? Now, why would you do that? Well, because you're going to want to speak now, and when you want to speak, I guarantee that you don't want to be interrupted. mid-sentence, and if you are interrupted mid-sentence, aren't you in a stronger position to say to the other party, look, I gave you the courtesy to hear you out, please extend the same courtesy to me, I haven't finished saying what I want to say. Okay? So it gives you that higher level of credibility to be able to articulate what it is that you expect of the other person in terms of their performance in that situation. Here's some more things that you need to think about when you're talking to people about poor performance. It is really important to avoid having an argument. This is not a time for an argument. Now, the other person might think it's a time for an argument, and that's their business. But at the end of the day, you're not engaging in an argument. You are trying to make sure that some poor performance is remedied and to ensure that it doesn't happen again in the future. That's all you're trying to do. It's nothing to do with arguing about he said this or she said that. Nothing to do with it. So my strong suggestion for you is to say to the other person, there's two things you can say actually. One is, I refuse to argue with you about this. Now, if you refuse to argue with them, then that's the end of it. You have all the power. Or you could say something like, we'll just have to agree to disagree on that point. We'll have to agree to disagree on that point. So there's a couple of skills there that you might be able to use, but at the end of the day, this is not a slanging match, and I can assure you, if it ends up being that, it will not be effective. And you might win the argument, but you're certainly not going to change their behaviour because they're too busy defending themselves. Another important key point in all this is please focus on the performance. It's not personal. This is about performance, and it's about the way people do their work and the task that you've assigned to them. So just focus on that. Really, really important. All right, so just make sure. That's why I believe a critical incident is the way to go. Critical incidents work fine. I mentioned this before and I won't go over it in great detail. Talk about the future and how things can be remedied for the future so that the incident, or at least the way somebody dealt with the incident, can be done differently. That's really, really important. Otherwise, what happens is you get into this whinging about this and that and everything else, and the person won't take any responsibility. What we're attempting to do is to get the other person to take responsibility for their future, and that's what the feedback's all about. I think it's very important in any feedback that's negative, where you've got poor performance, is to, wherever possible, emphasize and focus on strengths as well. Now, what's the worst case scenario? If you're giving someone feedback about negative performance, you can say at the end of that feedback, I've got every confidence that the next time you do that, you'll do things differently. Now, that's not an insincere statement. The fact of the matter is you would have that confidence, because if you didn't have that confidence, why are you bothering to give the feedback? So it's really about giving people a sense of encouragement. Okay, we've got another question here that I'll just read out and respond to while it's fresh. How would you respond to a person walking off and not acknowledging the feedback or conversation, or brushing you off? Yeah, good question, Kirsty. If someone walks off in a huff, then what you need to do, of course, is I just probably let that go for a little period of time, and then I would have another conversation with them, and this time perhaps I might do it in a room seated, because I want to talk to them about them walking off, right? You see, because by walking off, what they're doing is they're saying that they're not going to take responsibility for the feedback that you're giving them. And so I might start the next conversation off with them and say, look, I was very concerned yesterday. I was in the middle of giving you some feedback and you walked off. And we can't afford to have that. I wouldn't bother giving you the feedback if I didn't think it was important. And I really need you to stay and to listen and to engage with me. What do you think about that? You see, so that's how I would deal with it. But as I said, it's much easier if you're sitting in a room than it is standing up giving feedback, although probably I understand the nature of the work that you do in your business, Christy, that you probably will have a lot of opportunities to give feedback standing up. But that'll be the way I deal with it, and I hope that's been helpful. So yeah, I wouldn't tolerate that. That's called passive-aggressive behaviour. Or the other one is if people burst into tears. That's another good one. And if people burst into tears, we think, oh goodness, we've got to disengage. We can't continue this because they're in tears. Well, I don't know about that. I would actually say to someone, look, I really need you to stop crying. I really need you to listen to this. This is really important. You can say that in a nice voice. You don't have to be aggressive about it. But tears are also another way, another tactic that people use not to take responsibility for the feedback. So confront them gently about it and just say, look, I really need you to listen to this and to stop crying. Hand them a tissue if you must, but at the end of the day, you want them to stop crying and listen. So call their bluff, in other words. So hopefully that's been helpful for you. Another key point is seek out the causes. So ask questions around why did it happen? You know, who was involved? When did it take place? And sometimes it's good to say to people to start, if it's a complex thing, is to say, do you mind if I ask a couple of questions so that I understand what happened? Now that's a question, and it's a great question because they're not going to say no to that. And when they say yes to that, you can fire off several questions without feeling as if you're intrusive because you've asked permission to ask a series of questions, and then you can go ahead and ask them. So try that out because you really need to understand the bottom line, and that's very, very important. There's just a follow-up question here. I've had this happen in the past at a previous job, and I can handle tears but not passive-aggressive. Well, as I said, just confront them about walking away. Just confront them about that and let them know that you have an expectation that people will stay and listen to the feedback and engage with you in the feedback. So you confront them about that, not the incident that the feedback was originally based on, but the fact that they've walked away or brushed you off. Okay, now we've come to the end, folks, and if you've got another question, by all means type it in because I've got a couple of minutes left. But here's your homework, and you'll get homework from me every single time we meet, and it's very practical. But what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to make a commitment to yourself. I won't be checking up on you, but I'm more than happy for you to email me with your success stories. In fact, I'd encourage you to keep in contact with me while we work together over the next few months. But my homework for you is for you to make a commitment to give feedback 3 times a day for the next week. All right? Now, if you do that, that's 15 bits of feedback. And I don't care whether they're positive or negative. If you do that, you will find that it will make a remarkable difference. But I want you to get into the habit of doing it because that becomes critically important. Okay, we've got another question here, and I'll I'll respond to that. Thank you. Do you feel it's important that a manager is aware of their own personality traits and employees' personality strengths and weaknesses so that they can then communicate in those areas to be more effective? Absolutely important. I totally agree. And of course, as you know, in Unit 5, we're looking at understanding people and their personalities. But yeah, you've got to tailor your response to the people that you're working with. But nevertheless, your expectations, and this is where you don't budge 1 centimetre, your expectations of what people should do should never change, regardless of personality. So you see, you're being consistent and persistent in terms of the feedback and the expectations. However, how you broach those issues and incidents will depend partially on the personalities you're dealing with. And that's fine, because by dealing with people how they want to be dealt with, you're actually respecting them. All right, but your expectations and your commitment to those expectations never ever budges. And if you do that, you'll be well respected by people, even though they mightn't like what you say. Okay. How about giving feedback to your manager? That's a good question, Nadia. Good question. Look, I think the principles are pretty much the same. I realise that sometimes that's more challenging because it's a power relationship. You've got to use your discretion, but at the end of the day, if your manager has invited you to give them feedback, then you would be silly not to take up that invitation when it's appropriate. And bear in mind, it's both positive and negative. So if they've done something that you really appreciate, let them know. And if you've done something that perhaps you don't appreciate, let them know. That's the hallmark of a robust working relationship with your manager, when you can do that. But I understand it's not easy. So folks, that's pretty much it for today, and I've just got up on the screen, which will come up in the screen a little bit. You can see where we're going with this. We've got 6 modules that we get through. You will receive an email from me shortly with a copy of these slides plus a video recording. You will also, perhaps a little bit later, receive a link to complete your influencing profile in preparation for Module 2. So thanks guys, I've appreciated working with you, and until next time, continue to give feedback.